Fog clung to the Appalachian hills like an old memory, heavy and unwilling to lift, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. The air tasted metallic, laced with the scent of wet soil and something else, something older, something that hadn't yet faded despite decades of silence. By the time the stranger in the mud-stained wedding dress stepped out from the tree line, the sun was already losing its battle against the thickening dusk, leaving only the ghostly outline of her silhouette drifting toward the abandoned cabin. Her dress, once white, now looked the color of bone left too long in the rain. Her bare feet dragged through the leaves as though she carried invisible chains behind her, and her eyes, glassy, wide, and deeply wrong, seemed to flicker at things no one else could see. She didn't knock on the cabin door, she simply pressed her palm against the rotting wood, whispering a name that the wind snatched away before it could fully form. Inside, the floorboards answered with a groan, the kind of sound that didn't feel like settling wood but rather recognition. The house knew her. The woods knew her. And even the fading daylight seemed to recoil from her presence, retreating faster into the distant hollows of the mountain. No one remembered her family anymore, not properly. Folks down the valley spoke of them only in murmurs, in stories shared with a nervous glance toward the ridge, as though the trees might overhear. A family that lived too far from town and too close to one another. A family that went missing one winter, leaving behind the cabin, the cellar, the graves, and the awful silence that followed. The woman paused in the doorway, her breath hitching as though she could hear voices rising from the soil beneath her feet. She closed her eyes, trembling, then smiled a thin, fractured smile that didn't reach her haunted gaze. The bride's arrival begins with a stillness that unsettles the land long before she steps into view, as if the mountains themselves sense the return of something they had hoped to forget. She emerges from the thicket slowly, not with the frantic desperation of someone lost, but with the deliberate pace of a person walking toward a place she has rehearsed in her mind for years. Her dress, once the symbol of a future she was never meant to have, hangs in tatters around her thin frame, the lace stiff with dried mud, the hem torn by brambles, yet she clings to it as though letting it go would erase her last connection to the world. Her hair is unbound, wild and heavy from rain, strands clinging to her cheeks like vines trying to hold her back. She carries no suitcase, no blanket, not even shoes. The forest floor has already accepted her bare feet as part of itself. But it is her eyes that truly mark her, wide, glassy, unblinking eyes that reflect the woods as though they have lived inside her longer than any memory has. She pauses at the edge of the clearing where the old family cabin stands, staring at it with a mixture of longing and dread, as if every rotting board and leaning beam carries a piece of her own history. The cabin has not welcomed a human presence in decades, yet when she steps forward, the wind shifts in a way that feels almost like breath being drawn inward. She touches the door not like someone returning home, but like someone touching a grave marker, her fingers trembling as the wood creaks beneath her palm. The sound echoes faintly across the clearing, unsettling the birds in the nearby pines, and for an instant it feels as though the forest itself is listening. Her whisper is barely audible, shaped more by memory than breath. She speaks a name, maybe the cabin's, maybe someone who once lived inside, but the mountains seem to swallow it before it can reach the air. There is no hesitation in her step as she crosses the threshold. The hesitation lies only in the house, which groans under her weight as if both protesting and welcoming her return. Dust swirls around her like disturbed spirits rising to inspect the intruder, though she does not flinch or wave them away. Instead, she inhales deeply, taking in the scent of mold, rot, and old secrets, her expression softening into something painfully familiar, as though this ruin, this forgotten place, is the only setting in which she still recognizes herself. Outside, the sky darkens faster than it should, the trees leaning inward, their branches curling like fingers around the clearing, as if sealing her fate the moment she arrived. The forest around the cabin seemed alive in a way that was both mesmerizing and threatening, a slow-moving presence that pressed against the edges of perception. Each tree was gnarled and ancient, their trunks swollen with the memory of centuries, and the low hum of the wind through the branches carried voices that were almost words, fragments of conversations long ended, sighs of the lost and the forgotten. Locals who had once ventured too far into these woods spoke of hearing whispers, faint and indistinct, like someone calling your name just beyond the reach of reason, only to vanish when you turned your head. It was a place where sunlight rarely penetrated, and when it did, it fell in broken slivers across the mossy floor, illuminating nothing and everything at once. Shadows pooled in unnatural shapes, and the paths twisted back on themselves, creating the sensation of walking in circles even when moving straight. The forest had a memory, they said, and it did not forget easily. The bride felt it immediately as she entered the first stand of pines, a shiver crawling up her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Each step seemed to echo farther than it should, bouncing off invisible walls and returning in distorted tones that carried both familiarity and accusation. She could hear the soft cracking of branches behind her, though no one followed. Sometimes, in the quietest moments, it was as if the leaves themselves were shifting just to peer at her, their rustling forming patterns she almost recognized. Her presence in this forest was neither unexpected nor welcomed, it was acknowledged, studied, and judged. The woods seemed to breathe around her, inhaling her every thought and exhaling memories that were not hers alone. Even the birds were wary here. Hawks circled high above in motionless spirals, their cries sharp and unyielding, while smaller songbirds remained silent, hidden, their absence almost more threatening than sound. Beneath the canopy, the air was thick and heavy, carrying a metallic tang that reminded her of blood and wet earth. It was a forest that retained every secret, every act of violence and desperation, and it was capable of replaying them for those who dared to listen too closely. She felt the weight of generations pressing down upon her, the echoes of ancestors she had never met, some of them cruel, some broken, all intertwined in a web of silence and decay. When the wind shifted, it brought with it 1,000 faint voices, some pleading, some warning, and some murmuring in tongues older than the hills themselves. She stopped, closing her eyes, trying to discern which whispers were the forest and which belonged to her own fractured mind. The trees leaned closer, and for a moment she thought she saw shapes moving in the shadows, glimpses of figures half-formed, lingering just out of reach, and she realized that the forest did not merely remember, it watched, and it waited. The discovery of the birth records came on a gray, rain-drenched morning, when the bride wandered into the small county archives hidden behind the courthouse. The air inside was stale, scented with old paper and the faint rust of iron filing cabinets, and the dim light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the rows of shelves. She traced her fingers along the spines of ledgers that had not been opened in decades, feeling the weight of time pressing against her palms. When she found the section devoted to births and marriages, the pages seemed almost to sigh, as if they recognized her touch, reluctant to reveal what they contained yet unable to withhold it entirely. The bride began to flip through the brittle sheets, and the names began to form patterns that were both shocking and inevitable, like the slow tightening of a noose she had not yet seen. Generation after generation of her family was tangled in ways that defied ordinary comprehension. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and every union seemed calculated to keep bloodlines confined within a shrinking circle. Notes in the margins hinted at whispered arrangements, payments made to clerks to adjust dates or hide details, and comments about the importance of preserving the family line. Each record was a small confession, a trace of something unnatural that had been carefully buried beneath polite society and rural isolation. The bride traced her own name down the list and felt the weight of invisible hands pressing her toward the inevitable truth. She was the product of a lineage that had turned inward, generation after generation, until it had become a loop that could not be broken. The realization was both horrifying and strangely comforting. Horrifying because it explained the unspoken tension that had always lingered in her family, the murmured warnings from neighbors, the fearful avoidance in the way the world outside had always seemed to watch her with suspicion. Comforting because, for the first time, the chaos of her life seemed to have a structure, a dark design that could be understood. The blood that ran in her veins was not accidental, it was deliberate, preserved like a secret seed in the soil, growing twisted but resilient. As she continued to sift through the pages, she found letters tucked between the registers, notes written in cramped, shaky handwriting that chronicled illnesses, deformities, and the whispered fear that the blood itself carried something cursed. References to hidden graves, unexplained deaths, and sudden disappearances appeared alongside birth records as though the family's history was a ledger of sins carefully recorded but never admitted aloud. Every page she turned deepened the shadows in her mind, weaving a tapestry of inevitability, of a cycle that had been set in motion long before she was born, and that could not be escaped. The story of the vanished family had already taken on the weight of legend by the time she returned to the mountains, whispered in hushed tones at the general store, carried in the nervous glance of the townsfolk who still remembered them. The cabin where they had lived sat abandoned now, rotting under years of neglect, yet the memory of the family's disappearance lingered, pressing against the walls as if it refused to be forgotten. It had been one winter when the snow fell heavier than anyone had seen in decades, blanketing the hills in a silence so absolute that even the usual sounds of the forest seemed muffled. Neighbors reported that no one had seen the family leave, no tracks leading away from the cabin, no signs that they had ventured into the frozen wilderness. It was as though they had simply dissolved into the white, leaving only the faint echo of their presence behind. Stories circulated of the day the last fire had gone out in the cabin, leaving the hearth cold and dark. Some said the children had been seen playing near the creek that cut through the valley, their laughter hanging over the frozen water, but when anyone went to call them home, they had vanished. Others whispered of the father, of the mother, of the subtle tensions that had always existed among them, tensions that the isolation of the mountains had amplified. These accounts were never confirmed, never detailed, yet the absence spoke louder than any testimony. Doors remained locked, floors swept clean, and a cellar door at the back of the house had been bolted from the inside, a silent monument to the secrets it guarded. When she stepped onto the porch of the cabin, the chill of the winter decades ago seemed to linger in the air, biting her skin as though the frost had never melted. The ground was uneven, and depressions suggested long-forgotten footpaths now reclaimed by moss and roots. She knelt near the creek, tracing its bank, half expecting to find footprints that had eluded everyone else, yet there was nothing but the smooth imprint of snow and soil. Even the local dogs, known for their keen noses, avoided the area, their hackles raised in silent protest. Inside, the cellar door loomed like a dark promise. The hinges were rusted, the wood swollen and cracked, and when she pressed her hand against it, a shiver ran up her arm. Something in that small, locked space seemed to pulse, waiting, holding the air in a suspended breath. The creek nearby, the frozen ground, the skeletal trees, all of it whispered of lives halted, of a family erased from the map yet preserved in the memory of the forest. The absence of her ancestors was complete and haunting, and yet it drew her forward, compelling her to peer into the darkness of the past where others had feared to look, toward secrets that had waited for decades to be uncovered. The unearthed graves were discovered almost by accident, hidden behind the overgrown thicket that pressed against the back of the cabin, a place where the underbrush had claimed the land and sunlight rarely touched the soil. The ground there was uneven, mottled with patches of moss and the blackened stains of old decay, and when she knelt to brush aside the leaves, the earth gave way beneath her fingers in ways that suggested disturbance, recent disturbance. Small depressions appeared as though something beneath had shifted, clawed, or struggled to emerge, the soil still loose, damp, and scented faintly of iron. She froze, aware of the way the shadows stretched across the clearing, elongating the shapes of the graves into dark fingers pointing at her, as though accusing her of trespassing on a family secret that had fought to remain buried. The first grave she uncovered revealed nothing more than soil and the faint imprint of a shape beneath, but the second seemed fresher, as though someone or something had returned to dig where the dead had been laid long ago. The dirt clung to her hands, cold and sticky, and she felt the low thrum of unease in her chest, the primal recognition that the earth here held stories it was unwilling to tell. She worked carefully, moving debris aside, and the faint outline of human forms became visible. Not neat, not orderly like a cemetery with headstones and markers, but shallow, haphazard, almost hurriedly made. It was the sort of burial that carried the weight of panic or secrecy, and each movement of the soil revealed hints of what had been hidden, fragments of clothing, small bones, and the unmistakable traces of something disturbed after death. As she examined the graves, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the trees, scattering leaves across the site as if the forest itself sought to obscure her discovery. A sense of being watched prickled her skin. She could hear the faint creaking of branches and the whisper of leaves, almost like murmurs rising from the disturbed earth. The graves were not merely resting places, they were warnings, tangible reminders of the family's hidden history, of actions taken in the shadows that the world had chosen to forget. Something stirred beneath one of the shallow mounds, and she recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The soil had shifted as though responding to her presence, the contours of the earth rising and falling as if a hand below had pressed against it. Panic laced her chest, yet fascination rooted her in place. The graves were a threshold, a fragile boundary between the living and the secrets the mountains had been guarding for generations, and she realized that the past was not entirely dead. It had been waiting, patient and silent, for someone brave or foolish enough to unearth it. The bride's delusions began quietly at first, a whisper in her mind that grew louder with every step she took deeper into the woods surrounding the cabin. At times, she spoke to herself, murmuring names that had long since vanished from memory, names she insisted were still alive somewhere beneath the soil or just beyond the tree line. Her words were often incoherent to outsiders, phrases tangled with half-formed thoughts, yet in her own mind, they carried the weight of truth. She claimed to hear her family moving in the dark, calling for her in voices both tender and accusing, and she responded as though they were there, shaking hands at the invisible presence, whispering apologies, telling stories she alone could understand. The townsfolk who glimpsed her through the misted windows of the general store noticed the vacant gleam in her eyes, the way she sometimes smiled at nothing, and quietly stepped away, afraid that her world had become a different kind of reality, one that did not obey ordinary rules. Inside the cabin, she wandered from room to room, touching walls and furniture as though they were extensions of her own body, claiming that her family's spirits lingered in every corner, hiding in the shadows. She spoke of voices beneath the floorboards and scratching behind the walls, insisting that they were waiting, trapped by the unfinished work of a curse she alone could complete. Her fingers traced shapes in the dust, leaving convoluted symbols she said were instructions, warnings, or letters for the dead. When she knelt by the cellar door, she whispered for hours on end, recounting every memory she imagined her family would have if they were alive, speaking of arguments, laughter, and the quiet despair that had always existed beneath the surface of their lives. The forest itself seemed to respond to her obsession, the wind twisting in unnatural patterns, carrying fragments of voices she claimed to recognize. She insisted that the trees themselves were witnesses, that the roots had memorized every secret, and that she could coax them into revealing hidden truths if only she concentrated long enough. She slept little, wandering at night with a lantern, calling names into the dark hollows of the woods, claiming she could feel movement beneath the frost-hardened earth, as though the family were trying to signal her. Her delusions were not merely hallucinations but a kind of ritual, a compulsion driven by a conviction that she had to finish something left undone. She believed the family's presence lingered in the soil, in the cabin, in the wind, and that it was her responsibility to complete the cycle they had started or perhaps failed to finish themselves. Every sound, shadow, and whisper confirmed her suspicions, blurring the line between what had happened decades ago and the reality she was determined to create for herself, a reality where her family had not vanished but waited, always waiting, beneath the soil she now patrolled with reverent obsession. The cellar revealed itself slowly, a door half swallowed by shadows at the back of the cabin, its hinges rusted and groaning as if reluctant to be opened. She approached it cautiously, every step weighed down by the oppressive silence that filled the room, the kind of silence that made even the faintest creak of the floorboards seem deafening. Her hand rested on the cold, warped wood, hesitating only for a heartbeat before pressing down on the latch. The smell hit her immediately, a combination of damp earth, rot, and something fouler, a metallic tang that clung to the air like a living thing. The cellar had not been opened in decades, yet it seemed to exhale, as though it had been waiting for her touch, waiting for someone to uncover the secrets it had guarded so long. Inside, the walls were scratched, grooves carved deep into the wood and stone, evidence of desperation and struggle. They formed a chaotic pattern, nearly indecipherable, yet somehow conveying the terror and confinement that had once taken place here. Chains, broken and rusted, hung from hooks in the ceiling, remnants of a punishment or restraint that was far darker than any visitor could imagine. The deeper she went, the more she felt the pulse of the past pressing against her chest, the echo of every movement, every whispered plea, reverberating through the floorboards and into her own trembling limbs. The cellar was not just a room, it was a repository for memory, for violence, for things that should have been buried along with her family but were instead preserved in the very architecture of the house. Small signs indicated the unnatural nature of what had occurred, soil unevenly disturbed as though someone had tried to dig themselves free, marks on the walls that suggested a struggle prolonged and relentless, the faint traces of what might have been blood still clinging stubbornly to the cracks in the stone. The atmosphere pressed down on her, thick and suffocating, and she realized that every element of the cellar had been shaped not only by the people who had been confined there but by the intent behind their suffering. The space itself seemed aware, almost sentient, feeding off the fear it had absorbed over the years, holding onto it with a ferocity that would not allow even her imagination to fully encompass it. As she traced the walls with her fingertips, she noticed remnants of personal effects, fragments of clothing, small objects once cherished, now abandoned and rotting. These artifacts made the horror intimate. It was not merely the absence of life that haunted the cellar, but the persistence of presence, the lingering echo of a family that had been stripped of agency, confined in a place where walls bore witness to the unspeakable. Every scratch, every chain, every shadow seemed to whisper that what had happened here was not ordinary, that it had been deliberate, and that its weight was still heavy in the air, waiting for the living to confront it. The night of the red snow arrived like a visitation, an unnatural storm that seemed to bleed into the mountains rather than fall upon them. The sky had turned a deep, bruised red by late afternoon, a color that reflected off the snow in an eerie, almost living glow, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor. The wind howled through the bare branches, carrying the scent of iron and cold earth, and each gust sounded like whispered names calling her into the darkness. She watched the flakes fall, each one tinged with crimson as though the snow itself had been stained by the blood of the past. The forest around her seemed transformed, every tree and rock taking on a distorted, grotesque familiarity, as if the land were replaying some memory she had not yet fully understood. As darkness settled over the cabin, the figures began to appear. At first, they were mere shadows, shifting at the edge of her vision, glimpsed only in peripheral flashes. Then the forms solidified, faint but unmistakable, silhouettes of the family she had spent her life trying to reconstruct in memory and imagination. Their faces were pale, etched with fear and sorrow, their eyes fixed on her with pleading intensity. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air, a cold that seemed to seep into her bones, and yet she could not look away. They moved silently, gliding over the snow in a way that defied natural movement, and with each step they seemed to grow more insistent, circling her cabin and calling her name in voices that were at once familiar and alien. The storm amplified her senses, every crunch of snow beneath her feet echoing unnaturally, every snap of a branch sounding like a warning. She could feel the presence of the family pressing close, surrounding her in the swirling red snow, their forms shimmering and distorting, appearing and disappearing like reflections in broken glass. The lines between reality and hallucination blurred. She could not tell if they were ghosts, figments of her imagination, or something else entirely, something that had emerged from the darkness of the mountains themselves. The air was thick with whispers, murmurs of accusation and sorrow, a constant, low hum of voices speaking truths that she could not fully grasp but that demanded her attention nonetheless. She moved toward the window, pressing her hands against the cold glass, and the figures mirrored her motion, stopping when she stopped, shifting when she shifted. Each of them seemed bound by the same invisible chains that had marked the cellar, a silent testament to the terror that had once defined their lives. The storm intensified, snow swirling in eddies of red and white, and with it came a realization that the past was not dormant, it had returned in full force, tangible and insistent, demanding acknowledgement, and she understood that the night of the red snow was not merely a storm, it was a reckoning, a moment when the dead had been given the power to speak, to move, and to confront the living. The bride's confession came in fragments at first, whispered into the shadows of the cabin as though the walls themselves were worthy confidants, as though the trees outside had ears sharp enough to judge and forgive in equal measure. She spoke in uneven breaths, her voice wavering between fear and an eerie certainty, telling a story she had rehearsed in the dark for years, a story that both explained and excused the horrors of her lineage. Her words spilled out like fragments of a dream, half-formed memories mingled with visions she insisted were real, until the full truth began to emerge in the trembling light of the lantern she carried. The family had not simply disappeared, she said, nor had they been the victims of misfortune. They had been deliberately sacrificed, each act calculated to address a curse that had haunted their bloodline for generations. She described the curse in terms that were both vague and visceral, a legacy born of repeated unions within the family that had twisted not only bodies but the very essence of their spirits. Each death, each burial, was an attempt to halt the cycle, a desperate act intended to sever a chain of inescapable misfortune that had grown heavier with every generation. Her own life had been shaped by this knowledge, by the whispered warnings of elders and the secrets buried in yellowed ledgers, and it had driven her to the brink of obsession. She insisted that the family's demise was necessary, a ritual performed with solemn precision, meant not for cruelty alone but as a grim attempt to protect what remained of the lineage, to wrest control from forces older and darker than she could name. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to pierce the dimness of the cabin as she recounted the final days of her family, describing each act with clinical detail yet overlaid with the tremor of guilt that never left her voice. She spoke of fear, of pleading, of resistance and inevitability, and how the act of burying them had been both literal and symbolic, an effort to contain the curse beneath layers of soil and secrecy. As she spoke, the room seemed to tighten around her, the air growing thick, almost tangible, pressing in with the weight of memory and confession. Every shadow seemed to lean closer, every whisper in the corners of the cabin aligning with her words, affirming the reality she described. Her confession revealed a mind trapped between love and madness, devotion and horror, a woman who had been shaped entirely by a history she could neither escape nor fully comprehend. She was both perpetrator and victim, bound by ancestry and compulsion, and in acknowledging the truth, she exposed the full extent of the darkness that had defined her family for generations. Her voice cracked, the cadence faltering as she admitted what she had done, but even in that moment, there was no relief, no absolution, only the certainty that the past she had unearthed, the curse she had attempted to break, and the family she had destroyed were intertwined in a way that nothing could ever undo. The final unearthing came with a tremor that seemed to rise from deep beneath the earth itself, a vibration that shivered through the cabin and echoed into the surrounding forest as though the mountains were groaning in recognition. She had spent years convinced that the graves behind the cabin held the entirety of her family, that the weight of the curse and the bodies themselves were safely buried beneath the cold soil, and yet the ground now betrayed her certainty. The earth shifted underfoot, small mounds trembling as if something clawed its way upward, forcing her to step back, her breath catching in her throat. The loose soil crumbled like sand in her hands, revealing glimpses of shapes that were unmistakably human yet horribly distorted, as though the generations of inbreeding and secrecy had twisted flesh and bone into forms that defied reason. Panic surged through her, but fascination rooted her to the spot, compelling her to watch as the earth continued to split and heave. From the shallow graves, hands pale, misshapen, and trembling pushed through the soil, scraping against the roots of long-forgotten trees. Faces emerged next, blurred and grotesque, some barely recognizable as members of the family she had known from faded photographs and whispered stories, others monstrous in ways that suggested the corruption of the bloodline had deepened over decades. She felt the forest close in around her, the trees leaning as if to witness what was unfolding, their branches scratching at the red-tinged snow and shadows swirling at their base. The sound of soil and bone shifting was joined by a low, gurgling murmur, a chorus of voices that were at once familiar and utterly alien, calling her name, accusing her, begging for release, and somehow laughing at her horror simultaneously. Her hands trembled, reaching toward the figures as if to still them, to push them back beneath the earth, but they resisted her presence, writhing upward with a force that was both desperate and malevolent. The air was thick, suffocating, carrying the scent of wet soil and decay, mingled with something indefinably ancient, as though the mountains themselves had become sentient and were exhaling the accumulated weight of decades of hidden sin. She realized with a chilling clarity that what she had buried was not dead in any conventional sense. The curse she had sought to end had taken root, growing beneath the surface, feeding on the secrecy, the fear, and the twisted devotion that had kept it alive. As the last of the snow fell, tinged with crimson light, the figures fully emerged, half human, half something else entirely, and the bride understood that her attempts to control the cycle had failed. The earth had given back what she had tried to contain, and the family, or what they had become, was now free, rising from the soil with an inevitability as old and relentless as the mountains themselves. She stood frozen, caught between dread and recognition, knowing that the night had delivered a revelation that would change everything, that the shadows of the past were alive and demanding acknowledgement, and that nothing could ever return to the way it had been.